Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Okay, we're ready to go. And good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm E.J. McMahon, founding senior fellow of the Empire Center. I want to welcome you to this conversation about Governor Hochul's State of the State address yesterday. This is a special edition of the Empire Center's podcast, Messages of Necessity. And the message in question today, though, is the message with a capital M, which is the annual message of the governor to the legislature, which is actually required by the Constitution. And starting in the 1920s under Al Smith, it became a speech, kind of along the same pattern as the National State of the Union. So this was the second such speech by Governor Hochul since she took office, the first since she was elected to a full term. And suffice to say, this is the place where a governor is supposed to give you a sense of his or her vision for the state and what the agenda and the program is going to be in the years ahead. So to discuss what she said and their implications and what was there and what was missing, I'm joined by several of the top experts here at the Empire Center. Bill Hammond, the Senior Fellow for Health Policy, Peter Warren, the Research Director, James Hanley, our Fellow for Energy Policy, and Cam McDonald, who, in addition to helping out, being an adjunct on research on several key issues, is Executive Director of the Government Justice Center as well. We're going to be talking about some of the key aspects of this speech. I guess to start with, Peter, start with you. One of the overview of any state of the state usually begins with talking about broad economic and demographic forces for shaping the state and how the governor sees them and what she intends to do about them. What did we hear from Kathy Hochul yesterday about this?
Well, thanks, EJ. And as you mentioned, it's Governor Hochul is tasked by the Constitution to deliver the state of the state. But in a sense, the real verdict on the state of the state, the real opinion that matters is the residents of the state. And what they're saying the state of the state is their commentary is that they're leaving. And they're, as you pointed out, highlighting demographic data from the census and elsewhere. We used to talk about how 1 million people over a decade had been lost to net out migration. And now just in the past 2 years alone, it's about 2/3 of 1 million. So that's all been accelerated during the pandemic. To her credit, the governor does recognize this in her State of the State address. In the outset, she definitely does not try and avoid the issue, doesn't try and skirt the issue. She says it's real, it's a concern. Unfortunately, once you look at the rest of the address and even going through the entire State of the Union, State of the State book, as we all did, there's precious little in her address or in the book that actually would incentivize those who are considering leaving to stay here in the state.
I should mention, by the way, that there's a custom in Albany that's been in place for decades. Is there's a speech, one way or the other, with a speech text, although actually Andrew Cuomo had turned it into a PowerPoint slide deck. It was kind of in this interlude we had the last 10 years. But customarily, there's a speech, and there's also what they call the book, which is essentially more rhetoric and some details of everything the governor says in the speech, laid out in this case, over 150 or so widely spaced, large font, big margin pages. So it's about this thick. And yes, and the book is where the details are supposed to be, but there were no details about how she acknowledged that we're losing people, but there wasn't a particular pointed policy to keep people, or was there?
Yeah, there's a lot of policies obviously in there. As you say, the book it's several hundred pages. It's organized thematically. In a sense, it's a prelude to the budget, which will be coming out soon. And there are dozens and dozens of different items referenced.
Right.
At some point, those items will be crosswalked into a budget. There's a lot of spending, there's a lot of new programs, new items, but there's not enough information to actually quantify exactly how much spending there is, but there is enough in there to give you an indication it tells some things about the upcoming budget. Because
Well, start with the issue that is year in and year out is always top of mind, even if a governor doesn't want it to be or put it there, education. What does she have to say about education?
And as we know, education is one of the, along with healthcare, is one of the two big elements of the budget.
Right.
And with respect to education, in terms of what's going on overarching, again, we just talked about outmigration, and one corollary to that is there's an outmigration from the schools.
Right.
The schools there had been a long, slow secular decline in enrollment. Over the last 2 years alone, though, we saw a 5% decline in the past 2 years alone from the public schools, elementary, secondary. There's also been, again, long, slow secular decline from like the SUNY institutions, the four-year schools, community college, and from CUNY, and that also accelerated over the last couple of years. So the question is, how is the governor going to address this situation? And you would think, okay, well, if enrollment is down, are we going to, does that mean we need to spend less to spend the same amount per pupil? Or are we going to sort of right size the spending? Are there going to be qualitative changes in order to try and keep enrollment and to bring in new enrollment, for instance, by perhaps lifting the charter cap to provide more and
Which
better
she said
options?
during the campaign that she would favor.
Exactly. So she certainly had an opening. If she was going to do it, you would think she would have mentioned it in the State of the State.
Did she do it? Or,
She did not. Okay. She did not. And so with respect to elementary and secondary education, what she did is, again, she sort of doubled down. She had signaled before that she was going to increase foundation aid, which is the single biggest stream of education spending. And indeed, she proposes that she's going to increase it by $2.7 billion. That's a 13% increase in 1 year alone. A lot of that is, she had talked about doing that before, but we realized a little while ago it was going to cost an extra $800 million to do that due to inflation. And again, even though enrollment's declining, she still went ahead and did that. And then with respect to higher ed, there's a new initiative she's proposing where state taxpayers would be kicking into the endowments of the university centers, the 4 university centers, providing like matching funds to whatever private donors kick in. So this is a different new approach where instead of the legislature deciding how much and how public funds are going to go to the higher ed institutions, it's just going to go into the endowment so the schools can spend it however they want to.
So spend is kind of
that's right. The bottom line is she doesn't on education and in other areas, as we'll get to, and she doesn't take this opportunity to sort of curtail spending in light of a possible recession coming and we have out-year deficits projected. Instead, she actually proposes a bunch of new spending streams, and all that is kind of frightening when we know that the legislature is going to take her budget as a first bid and they're only going to add to it.
So we should get back to that recession issue or look ahead in a second. But as you mentioned, education along with healthcare are the two biggest areas of the budget. In fact, I think they're over half of the state operating funds budget together all by themselves. Bill, you had a comment yesterday that was in the immediate reaction to the Empire Center. Also, I think it got a lot of attention on social media, which is the main problem. Her plan for healthcare seems to be, Governor Hochul's, that she has no plan.
Right.
Could you get into that a little more and give us a little, and how that relates to the actual background of public health, of the health budget and Medicaid, for instance, in particular?
I mean, as you said, Medicaid is one of the two biggest programs in the state budget. And so I expected her at least to address it. Traditionally, governors sort of set aside a piece of speech to talk about Medicaid. It's a bit of a chore in some cases. In this case, she just decided, no, I'm not going to talk about Medicaid at all. The word was not used.
And now that's tired. And is that because Medicaid is kind of taking care of itself? And so why pay attention to it? Or
I mean, she spoke about mental health. I should probably mention that. She made a big push on mental health. She's talking about thousands of new slots, hospital beds, group home beds, services. And that's a big deal because that plays into homelessness and it plays into crime and perceptions of public safety. So that was an area that she did devote significant attention to. But the rest of the healthcare system, she devoted, I mean, almost literally zero attention. And here's the thing, we have a nurses' strike going on right now. We have nursing homes and hospitals clamoring about dire shortages of workers. They're, in some cases, they're curtailing services and diverting ambulances. So that seems to be a problem we should be thinking about. The Attorney General is suing nursing homes over flagrant abuse and neglect and fraud and exposing really pretty horrendous sounding conditions. None of that came up. We also, like, our Medicaid costs have been skyrocketing in recent years, in part because of the public health emergency, which required states to keep people on their rolls even when their eligibility expired. That is going to end at the end of March.
Right, we got billions, just to clarify, we got billions in extra federal aid for Medicaid.
About $3.5 billion a year in extra federal
Which is
aid.
Conditioned on not changing the program in any way that reduces.
And in effect, allowing it to kind of balloon up,
Right.
to be larger than it usually is. And Congress just voted in December that policy is going to end on March 31st. So
The end of our fiscal year.
Right. The extra money is going to phase out. And the state, like every other state, has the pretty significant chore of pruning its roles over the next 12 months. This is a significant challenge for state government. Her future budgets depend on successfully removing those people. She didn't even mention it. She didn't mention it. Not only did she not mention it in her speech, it wasn't addressed in the policy book.
Yeah.
So that's a big kind of blank spot in her agenda.
Did she, and of course, we mentioned it, we're in the aftermath of this hugely unsettling, disruptive event, the pandemic. The state's response to it was pretty sweeping and arguably heavy-handed in some respects. It was most associated with Governor Cuomo. There was a lot of controversy about nursing homes and about the transferring of elderly people from hospitals back into nursing homes and spread it. Is there anything about that looking back? Does she have any plan for learning lessons of that or addressing public health, the management of public health in the future?
So it's normal after a major disaster, and this is the biggest, arguably the biggest disaster in state history by some measures. It's normal in the aftermath of a disaster to review your response to see how it could be improved. And there are many ways in which our response could have been improved, which is true of a lot of levels of government. It wasn't unique to New York.
Right.
But nobody in Albany seems to want to do that. They seem to view it as politically toxic. She has, to her credit, she has initiated a review by a consulting group. It's pretty contained and small scale. She didn't mention it during her speech. It doesn't seem to be any kind of high priority. There was a mention in the book. She had this very ambitious, I want to reshape our healthcare system. I want to make it evidence-based. I want to change how we pay for it. I want to change what kind of care is delivered. And I want to review what happened during the pandemic. And to do all that, here's my plan. I'm going to appoint a commission.
Right.
It seemed very half-baked.
And it was in the book and not the speech.
It was in the
she
book.
Didn't talk about it.
And
it was in her supporting material.
Like, on the one hand, it sounded hugely ambitious to change literally everything about the healthcare system. But on the other hand, she didn't mention it during her speech, and she's kicking it to a commission. I don't know what to make of that, actually.
Well, that would bear watching and talking about, perhaps. A third big area that she talked about, which is always something everybody in Albany and political office seems to love to talk about these days, James Hanley, was energy policy. She talked about energy policy, and it relates to some of the other areas she talked about. Could you give us, some, how is she following up on, this is a crucial year for whether to implement or not, aspects of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA is called, which is this very overarching Cuomo era policy with the ambitious zero emissions and clean energy goals? Did she get into to what extent did she get into that? And what are the implications of that for the other areas?
Well, for those who've been paying attention to the Climate Action Council over the past several years, they recently in December finalized their scoping plan for the guidebook for implementing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The scoping plan is not itself law, but it's supposed to implement. Supposed to be the guide for implementing the CLCPA through statute and regulation. And reading between the lines, I'd say she's adopted the scoping plan lock, stock, and barrel. And probably the most overarching kind of jewel in the crown of that scoping plan is a proposal to have a cap and invest system for greenhouse gas emissions, where we would set a cap for greenhouse gas emissions for the whole state, and then businesses would have to buy at auction allowances for emissions. And this would be done annually, with the amount of emissions allowances reducing year over year to meet CLCPA goals. And the investment, the funds from those auctions then could be invested for a variety of purposes associated with the CLCPA.
Invested by whom?
By the state, primarily by state bureaucracies. I would guess most likely by NYSERDA and the DEC.
The New York State Energy Research
and Development Authority. Yes.
And by the way, there was, she seemed to be touching on an area of the CLCPA that we've heard legislative proposals. It was phrased oddly, and I want to ask you about it, which is she doing her own version of outlawing gas and fossil fuel furnaces in new homes and other construction?
Yes, she has adopted the Climate Action Council proposals, attacking this in multiple ways. One is to pass legislation, the All Electric Buildings Act, although she didn't mention it by name, to prohibit gas hookups in new construction, to require all new construction to be electric only, and then to transition current homes to all electric by banning the sale of gas and propane furnaces, for example, pushing everybody to transition to using heat pumps instead of gas for heating. A hugely ambitious plan to transition 1 to 2 million buildings by 2030, which is only 7 years away.
Well, now that would have implications for another area we haven't discussed yet. Now, we asked Peter perhaps to talk about it also. Is she made a big deal about housing. In fact, she led with adding 800,000 housing units. Yeah. But does this have implications for housing? I mean, is any connection acknowledged in proposing that you can't have a conventional furnace?
Everything magically is going to be cheaper for the consumer. And where it's not cheaper for the consumer, the state's going to help fund it to make it cheaper for the consumer. So don't worry, EJ. Nobody's actually going to be having to pay through the nose for any of this.
I wish I'd known that before I got my $16,000 air heat pump heating up.
But she also promises that no low-income New Yorker will have to pay more than 6% of their income for electricity. So anything over that is going to fall on other ratepayers or taxpayers. It's not clear which. And as we electrify everything, and including electrifying vehicles so that we're going to be charging those at homes, the cost of that is presumably going to continue to increase, the cost that's dumped on either other ratepayers or taxpayers. But she didn't give any kind of estimate for how much that might cost.
Well, so there's some other specifics to touch on, but I wanted to, in general, while acknowledging some positives here, I'm just wondering, there's a lot of negatives, I think, safe to say, are missing pieces and with large gaps in this. Cam, are there any other positives or any positives in this that we're missing in terms of positives in this?
Yeah, there's some nuggets. I mean, one of the first steps to recovery is sort of admitting you have a problem. And there were a few spots in the state where the governor admitted the state has a problem with barriers to entry to business, with occupational licensing and formations of corporations. So she's gone partway to recognizing this problem and trying to address it. So, for instance, Bill mentioned, and this is something maybe the other side of out migration is in migration, and that's a net number. So, attracting people here or keeping people here can be important. And one of those ways is to eliminate barriers to entry vis-a-vis licensing. So last year, she proposed, for instance, to address the shortage of medical professionals in the state, entering into the interstate physician licensing compact and nursing compact, which is where the state would recognize there's 30 some odd states part of this compact where you just allow people to come practice in the state. That allows, and that also would allow New York doctors who are part of the compact or nurses to participate via telemedicine out of state. So there's a win-win there. She proposed it last year and it fell out of the budget documents. It's somewhere along the process. So I don't know where the opposition to that was. On the same note, with respect to the medical professions, she's proposing again to increase the scope of practice for professionals. So last year, for instance, the legislature did pass legislation allowing nurse practitioners to practice with a lesser degree of physician supervision, which allows them to maybe practice in more underserved areas and provide higher services. And so there's a push nationwide to have medical professionals generally be able to work at the maximum scope of their license, which they may not do for many of them in New York. And as part of the pandemic response, there were emergency orders that allowed this sort of thing and allowed people from even Canada to come practice medicine here. So there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to expand this and go further. Even so far down as cosmetology licenses, where she's proposing to lessen the burden.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.
And it's you talk about the minimum wage, you talk about opportunities for people. What's a better way for somebody to get started in the business than getting into a salon and shampooing hair without needing 300 hours of course?
You got to be careful when you're shampooing. I think
I have another positive.
Yes.
Again, because it was in the book and it wasn't in her speech, it's hard to know how much juice she's going to put behind this, but she talked about reforming the so-called certificate of need process. And this is probably most of the public has no idea that this goes on.
That 30 years ago.
But if you want to make any significant change in a hospital or a nursing home or a clinic, pretty much any large-scale medical provider, you have to go to the health department and ask for a certificate of need, which is basically permission to do it. You have to demonstrate that there is a need. So you have to have a study. The people who own the project have to pass a kind of a background check. This is it's an opportunity for your competitors to come in and stop you from opening. And it restrains the supply of medical services in the state. And that means reduced choice and higher costs. So any move she would make, if successful, to roll that back, to give people more flexibility to open new healthcare facilities is going to be good for consumers. But she didn't give a lot of details.
On that note, on the certificate of need note, the COVID pandemic highlighted this when ambulances were racing all through New York City 3 years ago almost. There was a all-women Hasidic ambulance corps that was not allowed to operate because they had received opposition to their certificate of need application. The state ultimately fixed that, but nevertheless, that shows just how bad the process can be for the public.
One thing that immediately occurred to me, because you mentioned, or one of you mentioned, the minimum wage, and we haven't mentioned that. She had some proposal on the minimum wage. And by the way, by way of background, under Governor Cuomo, the minimum wage in New York was raised to $15 downstate, initially in New York City. It's now his budget division and his progressively raised it further upstate as allowed by legislation. She most recently raised it to over $14 in the bulk of upstate New York. Mm-hmm. So we already have a pretty high minimum wage by national standards. Only a few states are higher. Mm-hmm. What did she propose doing on a minimum wage, and how did she justify it?
Yeah, and EJ, as you know, the federal minimum wage is still $7.25, right. and New York's minimum wage has doubled over the past decade, right. already. We should recognize that there is a proposal in the legislature to raise the minimum wage. I believe it's Jessica Ramos. It's gotten a lot of attention at the last couple of months to raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour and then increase it by inflation. The governor talks about raising the existing minimum wage by attaching it to CPI going forward. Which is something that there are some other states have done that. There's also some evidence that hurts job growth, right. Not surprisingly. In terms of a justification, I don't know if there's like a real economic justification, sort of a political justification that, well, things are getting more expensive, and to the extent that expenses are increasing, we need to pay people more so they can pay those expenses without really wrestling with the reality that, well, but then that. If once you raise the minimum wage, obviously, like in a restaurant, you raise the restaurant's costs, which can raise prices right. further, and you get into a.
She had this line where she said, as I recall, and you mentioned this yesterday on social media, where she said, "Your costs are going up, but we're going to make sure when costs go up, your wages go up." And the unspoken right. part was when wages go up, we're going to make employer costs go up,
and then your costs are going to go up further.
So she had that, and she did acknowledge that there have been widespread expectations of an imminent, if not already, recession that's upon us, an economic yes. slowdown, and a disruption in the flow that was projected in her budget. She kind of mentioned it, as if I recall correctly, in the speech. Does she have any other way of dealing with that? Or I trying to recall if there was any. Does she have any general economic program in general for economic growth or development, or?
No, it's very hard to discern a vision in this area as in other areas. And a point I just make with respect to the minimum wage, her proposal being illustrative, is in a lot of other areas, there's kind of a common theme where she's proposing things along that the legislature wants to do, and she's proposing a partial version. She also proposes here something else that could be quite costly, to expand the childcare, publicly subsidized childcare, to people to lift the income ceiling, so people of more means than currently can qualify for childcare. Jabari Brisport in the legislature wants universal childcare. So, but what she's doing here, and apparently this will be in her budget if it's consistent with the state of the state, she's raising the floor, and then that's just going to, we know they're going to keep bidding it higher. And what is her rationale for doing this in between? What vision does it reflect? It's not clear that there is a vision. So the legislature is going to say, why not raise it higher? You agree it needs to be raised. You agree there should be a minimum wage. Needs to be increased. Why not increase it to our level?
She's conceding the issue to them up front, putting something on the table.
Right.
That's like, this is the opening of a negotiation process, right? These are my ideas. They're going to come back with their ideas, and they're going to try to find a compromise.
Right.
It's also the state speech tends to be the good news, right? Like her budget, if there are any cuts to come to offset the new spending she wants to do, that has to be outlined in the budget. But as Peter just said, if you start off the negotiation and all of your ideas are kind of limited versions of what you think the legislature wants to do, you're like the compromise is just going to move in the legislature's direction unless you have something over here that you want and they don't want. and I didn't hear anything. The housing thing might be,
So
if she really fights for the housing thing, that's something that'll probably a lot of the legislature won't want to do, depending on what it looks like.
Well, she spoke about building 800,000 units of housing and having a state mandate on localities that they must meet a quota of a certain percentage to allow more new housing construction than they've been allowing.
I thought this was in her previous speech about this, which was given, I think, in December. I thought it was interesting because she emphasized this can't be about money.
Right.
We already, as a state, we spend a lot of money on housing. She also said it can't be about rent control or rent regulation because as a state, we already do a lot of that. Right. We have to work on the supply side.
The supply side.
We have to loosen the rules that inhibit people from building new housing. She's also talking about a tax credit, which is,
but for the most part, as you say, it is about sort of deregulation, and we have to give her here at least partial credit for recognizing, as Bill says, that the problem, this is not a lack of spending. This is an area where we need deregulation. There's some mention in the press release she put out specifically on this issue about waiving environmental review for certain housing developments. It's not clear exactly how she's going to enforce this. I don't know if I want to call it a mandate, this goal she wants localities to adopt, where around the state, every town and village over the next 3 years would increase the supply of available housing by 1% and would increase by 3% over 3 years in areas closer, more downstate MTA, where there is, a lot of available real estate, and, zoning is an issue. And indeed, I know, EJ and the Empire Center has talked about this, regulatory barriers to housing as a reason for driving up the cost, limited supply, and the cost of rentals. But Seeker in particular.
Well, she alluded to very kind of in a general way alluded to environmental impact. I think
she did,
but we had the state
environmental impact statement.
She talked about environmental
making them more efficient and doing them faster.
Right, which is kind of just the broadest possible, but because we actually have the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which, by the way, self-advertising, the Empire Center did a big report on this almost 10 years ago, which remains completely relevant and timely in every respect because absolutely nothing was done to address the issues it raised. Cuomo's people were stepping in the direction and backed off. But we have one of the most stringent environmental quality review laws of any state in the country. That process, the so-called Seeker process, can be used quite and has been used quite a lot to block or indefinitely delay a whole lot of development, housing and commercial and industrial. And that leaves a lot of unanswered questions about that. But I want to ask another question about regulation before I forget, because it's one of the questions we've gotten from our audience about housing. You were talking about how the legislature has a clear agenda in some of these areas, and where she's already sort of conceding to them. In housing, at least, in a broad way, she's talking about addressing the supply side, which is good. But the fact remains the legislature is intensely focused on re-regulating and upping the ante of regulation. And one question is, one of the faves, certainly in the Senate among a large cadre of legislators, is the so-called good cause eviction bill, which essentially means it would make it really difficult to evict anyone bill, which, in addition to the broader rent control law that the state enacted 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago now, would be arguably very bad for rental housing supply in terms of market rate. Did she say, if not in the speech, in the book, did she say anything about that subject, which is such a big, this is mentioned constantly by the legislature?
I don't believe so. And I have to confess that I'm not 100% sure. I think it would have got a lot of attention if she had endorsed good cause eviction. As you point out, just for those who aren't aware, the good cause eviction, as introduced, the legislative proposal is essentially rent control for upstate. And several localities upstate have adopted good cause eviction within those individual jurisdictions. I think they've also, in some cases, been subject to legal challenge. But that's something, as you say, that many in the legislature fervently desire and will be pushing for this year.
I mean, it's interesting because they have a broad, regulatory agenda. Many members, large critical masses of legislators of progressive caucuses in both houses and really want to aggressively pursue these agendas. And as we said about the book that the so-called book, we're going to put up and we'll send participants in this discussion and post on the podcast webpage. We'll have a link to the so-called book so you can see all of the details such as they are yourselves and any other work we've done that we mentioned. And I should also mention, we put out a report with a broad array of participants called The Next New York a few weeks ago, which is a different agenda, not just ours, a meatier and denser agenda, if you will, for a lot of these areas, which we'll also post a link to again, nextnewyork.net. And again, to her credit, the mental health, adding psychiatric beds for serious psychiatric illnesses is something that Steve Ide of the Manhattan Institute's very well-known mental health expert, he advocated that in the book. Looking at housing as a supply side issue is something that Howard Usock said in the book. There's a few aspects. There's some things that were sort of touched upon. Crime, which we've not mentioned, but in that book, Rafael Mangual talks about the need for reform of the so-called reform. She sort of took a step in that direction in the book, but which brings up the bigger issue. What did she say, Bill? As somebody who's aside from, in addition to all of your detailed healthcare work, you've covered the legislature as a reporter and a columnist in the politics of the situation. There's a lot of subtext to what's going on now politically. How did that? Was that reflected in the speech at all? This tension with the legislature on criminal justice and on her nominee for chief judge, for instance, how was that reflected at all in any of these discussions?
There's traditionally a tension between the governor and the legislature, right. And that often plays out in the message, the State of the State speech, where they challenge the legislature. They implicitly chastise the legislature for not doing certain things, and sometimes they get booed, sometimes they get heckled, and that I think actually works for governors who do it, because they're the ones who are standing up for the people against the powers that be in Albany. I didn't see that kind of dynamic in the governor's speech. She has said that she's a less, I don't know what the right word is. She doesn't want to be a bully, right? She's distancing herself from her predecessor, Andrew Cuomo, who was seen as being excessively bullying. So maybe she's going a little too far in the other direction of being too accommodating and too friendly and wanting everybody to get along. And so there are things in her agenda which will be a challenge for the legislature, but she didn't kind of highlight that in her speech. She didn't sort of draw any lines. And an example of that I thought was very intriguing, that there's a vacancy on the state's top court, Court of Appeals, for the chief judge of the Court of Appeals. Right. This is one of the 3 or 4 biggest jobs in state government. Her role is to nominate somebody. She's given a list of nominees. From this nominating commission, she picked the guy just before Christmas, Hector LaSalle.
Yeah, Judge LaSalle, yes.
He's come in for all this criticism from progressive groups. I think a dozen or more state senators have declared before even having the hearing that they're going to vote against him. So her nominee for this job is in trouble. She's said strong things about she's going to stick with him and she thinks he's been a victim of character assassination. The legislature was in front of her yesterday. She could have taken them to task for not giving her nominee a hearing. She could have made the case for her nominee. She could have rallied the potential supporters. He's being caricatured as an extreme right-wing judge, which is absurd. He's very mainstream. He's probably left of center by most standards. She could have pointed that out. She could have taken them to
Right.
school on this guy, and his name didn't even
No artful
the whole
allusions to that or to the pay
Zero.
raise she just signed.
zero. Which so she seems to be really averse to that kind of confrontation, and I don't think that's going to work well for her in the long term.
A specific question also from one of our listeners is James, for you. When she made this statement that somehow we're effectively going to cap everybody's utility bills at 6% of their income.
Well, for low-income people.
For low-income people, if we're going to make sure that nobody who's low income, or whatever that is, pays more than 6% of their income, well, who is going to be footing the bill for them? I mean, where does that slide to?
She didn't specify that. So, I mean, there are three options. One is through ratepayer hikes, where the rest of the ratepayers will pay for it and people get rebates. Another is through rebates via the tax system. But I think most likely what she's thinking about is funds from the cap and invest auctions, because she sort of separates these, so it's not entirely clear. The document wasn't the most well written, perhaps, but she talks about using some of the proceeds from cap and invest for rebates for low-income homeowners in their utility bills. She also talks about using the proceeds from the cap and invest system for a variety of other CLCPA related issues. But then there's concern about what they call in the scoping plan, energy intensive and trade exposed industries, those that are likely to flee the state rather than participate in these auctions. And so they're going to give away free emissions allowances to these industries.
Semiconductor manufacturing, maybe.
Yes, which of course is going to reduce the take they get from these auctions. So how they plan to actually spend as much as they plan to spend when they don't get as much money as they anticipate there are no dollar signs attached to any of this.
So the auctions are supposed to have this beneficial effect in terms of suppressing emissions, and have the side benefit for the state politicians of creating this slush fund that can be redistributed.
Yes,
except not as big as it might be, because we have to make sure that we don't charge enough to affect any
businesses,
any
right
industry,
keep any businesses.
Right. And in the document, I don't know if she said this in her speech, but in the document it says this will lower consumer costs. Now, how you raise business costs and lower consumer costs is a bit of a mystery to me. But
they'll have higher minimum wages.
I guess so.
Bill, you were going
to. I mean, the discussion of how things get paid for, and what I said before about her not being confrontational, she did include a line in her speech where she said there will be no increase in income taxes this year, which could be read as, shutting down talk in the legislature especially among progressives, where there is a lot of sentiment where they want to raise income taxes. And when the budget comes out and when deficits start appearing on the horizon and when she starts talking about spending cuts, the pressure for an income tax increase will amplify. So that was a line in the sand. She has some ability to enforce that, right? She writes the budget and she has veto power over the budget. On the other hand, the legislature has what are called veto-proof majorities. They technically have enough Democrats to override her vetoes if they choose. Another tax-related issue, which it's kind of funny, it got very little attention, but she's talking about raising the cigarette tax by $1, about roughly $1, about 20%. So that's a pretty big increase in the cigarette tax. I need to look back at the numbers, but my impression is that our cigarette tax is so high, it's already more than $4, that you have significant tax evasion, people importing cigarettes from other countries and from other states.
We have a very high degree.
To the point where that tax is getting diminishing returns, right? Like at some point you raise it high enough, there's so much evasion that you stop getting revenue from the tax. And I think we've already gotten to that point in New York State. There's some case to be made that, making it that expensive to buy cigarettes inhibits people, especially young people, from starting smoking in the first place. But there again, I think there's diminishing returns. If tax evasion results in a lot of cheap cigarettes on the streets, you get a diminishing return.
Well, there's we're basically, from a fiscal standpoint, preferring that they smoke marijuana.
Historically, these any increase in the cigarette tax generally flies through, and in fact, the legislature might even add to it because they'll convince themselves that it's going to bring in more money that they can spend on.
Meanwhile, almost every other jurisdiction has established that the black market continues to thrive when pot is legalized.
It's really raising the tax at this point is subsidizing the black market. And in the past, I don't know if this has continued, but in the past, some pretty nasty people were in the black market, including in a couple of cases, terrorists, where selling black market cigarettes to raise money. So,
well, I mean, there's so many other aspects of this. I mean, that we could be getting into, but I continue to be struck both by the seeming contradiction in the sense, Peter, as you said, the governor acknowledged that we've had this population drain, which has been going on for a long time. She forgot to say, as the Empire Center has pointed out, that there's only so much time she had. She acknowledged that, and then and even acknowledged, that we might have a recession coming. But the housing was supposed to be a response. New housing construction was supposed to be sort of a response to the population loss, which she attributes entirely to the shortage of affordable housing for the middle class. And then which surely is one factor, but not the only one. And then, but there again, I'm wondering, was there anything in the speech or the book about the economy in general? In other words, in a negative way or a highly questionable or arguable way, Andrew Cuomo every year would have some gargantuan economic development program. It's what led to and blew up in his face ultimately in some ways. It was starting with the Buffalo Billion. His second state of the state was the Buffalo Billion, which ultimately led to the indictment and conviction of our nanotech mastermind and his closest aide. But and the solar panel plan in Buffalo, which, speaking of reviews of the pandemic, but there's no call for reviews of what happened there. But did I hear her mention like new computer plants and then just kind of not talk about anything else? What was she talking? Did she say anything about the economy?
There is
about the link between that and finances and tax revenue and other things.
Very, very little. There were some like workforce training, what kind of small potatoes stuff. Nothing transformational. There was just the usual, kind of like a minor grab bag of kind of narrowly targeted business incentives, but again, nothing unusual. And it's worth pointing out that even on the housing, which again, all in all, it's a major proposal, at least the change she's seeking. But it's worth noting that the 800,000 units that can include public housing units, and there's basically some extra points in the formula she refers to in terms of attaining those standards to the extent that you're adding public housing units. And as we know, to the extent that people are going to be and end up moving out of state because they can't find, because housing is hard to find or unaffordable here, it's generally not people who qualify for publicly subsidized housing are going to be the ones who, we're going to go out of state to find more publicly, better publicly subsidized housing.
Well,
If I could add, she did talk about kickstarting the green economy, and that's supposed to be the consequence of the spending from the emissions auctions.
Right.
She didn't go into detail, but she was referring to such things as spending money on renovating houses and schools and government buildings to be more energy efficient, probably dumping more money into renewable energy, although she wasn't specific about that, but she did use the phrase jumpstart the green economy. So yes,
well, that's a phrase that will fill air when you say it.
Yes.
By the way, one of our listeners has pointed out something more than a question, is that she said there'd be no increase in income taxes But speaking of the minimum wage, that she's going to index the minimum wage to inflation, but our income tax is not indexed to inflation. So
that's right. That's right.
If you were on the edge of your bracket, your income tax is going to go up automatically with inflation anyway. So
and as we've discussed, that is a recommendation Empire Center has made.
Right.
And obviously, if it was adopted when we made it, then it would have a meaningful impact in light of the rising.
There was a period of time under Cuomo as part of his deal with the Republican Senate majority, in like 10 years ago. For a few years, the income tax code was indexed for inflation, and then that was undone as part of the later deal.
We should probably clarify, when you say indexing the tax code, you mean indexing the bracket.
The bracket.
You don't mean that. You don't mean that the tax rate should go up.
No. Basically, it means that, which the federal government did 40 years ago, is that the brackets, the income brackets that are graduated and progressive, would rise with inflation, which means that you wouldn't be automatically pushed into a higher tax bracket if your income didn't go up.
Yeah.
Also, the standard deduction, which most people actually claim, would increase with inflation.
And I did a blog post about this a little while ago to try and illustrate if it had been.
A link we'll put in this.
If the brackets and the deduction had been tied to inflation, it really would have. It would be a meaningful impact. And we haven't talked a lot about inflation here or macroeconomic factors, as again the governor didn't talk a lot about in her speech about the impact of potentially of a looming. But we could have a significant recession this year. It's obviously a massive impact on state finances, and it affects the budget, the state budget, large and small. I think I may have mentioned earlier that in foundation aid, again, one of the single biggest line items in the state budget,
school aid,
right? The biggest element of school aid, one of the biggest line items in the budget, is about $25 billion. A few years ago, both Cuomo and then Governor Hochul had gotten on board with this idea of, quote, fully funding this foundation aid formula, and it was supposed to cost a certain amount according to those projections. And then, in light of recent inflation, we now find that in order to follow through on this promise in the coming budget, it's going to cost an additional, for the 1 year alone, it's going to cost an additional $800 million because of inflation. And so again, inflation is increasing the cost of a lot of things. That's just one example in the budget. And yet, how we're going to, it's not necessarily increasing the revenues. And
well, to wrap up here, because now we're going to look ahead and, sort of prediction time, or what might be expected, what one is led to expect from this. So the budget is due out by February 1st. It's later after a gubernatorial election under the Constitution. So on or before February 1st, she has to present an executive budget. Based on what we saw yesterday, we'll go around starting with you, Cam, in the areas you looked at. What do we think, given the tone and the substance of what she had to say yesterday on the issues you follow and on issues in general, what is the outlook for Governor Hochul as an executive and as somebody, what to the extent she has a vision, what can we expect to see in the next few months here in Albany?
As far as what I pointed out with respect to the occupational licensing and streamlining things for business and so on, I think at best you might get some administrative, executive biting around the edges. If she puts anything in the budget doc, I expect them to come back out if they get any sort of opposition. I think she's really just dipped her toe into this area and hasn't shown, to me, a willingness to kind of, pocket veto salaries to get something in exchange, or as Bill pointed out, really take the legislature to task on her chief judge. So there's some ideas that have been thrown, they're going to get tossed.
And James, in the energy area, you've already written a lot about how feasible a lot of this is and how, in fact, you've made the point, and you're not the only ones. It's just this is actually, up beyond a certain point, not actually feasible. The goals of the climate CLCPA, and as she's doubled down on. Do you get any sense that there will be any pulling back in the near future from this agenda and its implications for the economy? Or
no, in fact, she's proposing to have things done as a climate action council. They're proposing to have as much of it as possible done bureaucratically through regulatory rulemaking, so we can avoid some of the difficulties of statutory legislative lawmaking, keep the public a little bit more out of the loop, and keep moving full steam forward. And we have the New York Independent System Operator, NISO, is out there, and they're kind of repeatedly yelling in a nice, polite, bureaucratic tone of voice, this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work. And they're just accused of scaremongering, and it's
the group that runs the electric grid is not any particular interest other than keeping the
right. The ones that are most responsible for the reliability of electricity coming into your homes and businesses is the one that's most worried, and they're not being listened to.
Peter, just briefly, we only have a couple of minutes yet, but what would your overview be? Pessimistic, optimistic?
My biggest takeaway is the lack of takeaways. I think I would say in the state of the state it's her second state of the state, but the one she gave last year was, let's face it, she had an election in front of her,
right?
And some uncertainty, and she was trying to get through the year, get past the election. This was her opportunity. If there was a vision to unveil, this is it. First year of a brand new term, right at the outset. This is when you've got the political capital. We've got, and it's just not there, apparently. And so, to me, that just means the legislature is going to drive things, and so that's going to be the story for the next few years, including on spending.
Whether that is the scenario plays out will be determined in the next few months.
That'll set the tone for the whole.
Does her Court of Appeals nominee get confirmed or rejected? If it's a rejection, she's weakened.
Yeah.
Does her budget draw any lines? Does it get passed? Does she get over? Does she veto? Does she get overridden? We're going to know the answer to those questions sometime in early April, or that's what I would guess. And whether she can carve out a space as a strong governor who's going to lead and direct the state and corral things in Albany, that's what we're going to find out in the next few weeks.
Well, so that's the somewhat, I think, pessimistic outlook we have based on what we saw yesterday. We hope you'll keep up with all of the Empire Center's output and analysis of these state issues as time goes on. There's a lot to talk about in this. We hit, I think, most of the main important points, and we're going to keep looking at them in the future. And for now, thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to sharing more with you in the future. And thanks, and have a good day and a good week.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.